Hi everyone. Hope you had a wonderful Christmas and wishing you all a very happy New Year. As part of the prep for ongoing Australs, the ATCO reached out to a few of us um, in order to essentially make lectures so that your prep is best ensured before the tournament starts. Which is why today I'll be talking about debating South Asian topics. So hopefully this will be useful for you all. Uh, just before moving on, a few disclaimers. A lot of the things that you'll be hearing are a part of my own research and information that's been fed to me by my debating friends and my coaches and my juniors and seniors. So if there is something that you feel is inappropriate or are not a true reflection of where you live or where you are, I'm very sorry for that beforehand. It's probably because I don't know any better. But then again, hopefully most of it is accurate and it'll help you prep for Australs in the best way possible. Now, in terms of South Asia, I think it's one of the most difficult regions in the world to sort of like paint with a singular brush, mainly because the countries over here are just super diverse, not in terms of just political makeup, but also in terms of how they're run and what situations and the problems that they're facing at this particular point of time. Which is why you will see at most times it is very difficult for any H code to come up with a motion that applies to all of South Asia in one go, which is why if you get South Asian debates, I think mostly it will probably be focused on specific country in South Asia as opposed to the entire broad region as well. The similarities are like, so for example, with you get ASEAN debates, which talks most about Southeast Asia, or you get European Union debates that most often talks about the European Union. But with South Asia, I think in general as an H code in the past, myself, I probably it's probably very difficult to sort of like come with a broad holistic motion that applies to the entirety of South Asia as a whole. Which is why I think it's best for everyone to sort of like prep in a manner where you know specifically about each and every country, or just the bare minimum. So when the debate does come up, you don't get lost inside it. However, over here, I'll try to talk about the more common aspects of South Asia politics, so as to ensure that you're not completely lost if a motion essentially comes about. The other thing I think probably moving forward would probably be that most of the knowledge over here is derived from a lot of the events that have happened in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh specifically. Not because I feel personally that these are the most important issues, but mostly because I feel these are the most common topics that Ashkors in the past have preferred to put in the tournaments. But also, secondly, I think me living in one of these countries, I've been personally impacted by these issues more than the others, which is why I think the onus is on you to sort of like go out and research on other countries and other topics that might not be included as much in this particular lecture. Okay. All right. So the first thing that I think it's very important to notice about South Asia as a whole is that all countries or majority of the countries in this region have an extremely strong sense of nationalism, a strong sense of nationalism that is continuously exploited by the ruling elites, i.e., the governments in these particular countries. So, say for example, for countries like Bangladesh, this strong sense of nationalism is driven from the 1971 war that Bangladesh had with Pakistan, in which East Bangladesh essentially ended up becoming East Pakistan ended up becoming Bangladesh. So, and even in countries like India and Pakistan, still to this day, the old guard derives nationalistic pride from defeating the other. Uh, Especially when we're talking about India and Pakistan. Mainly, I think because for these countries, the very fact that they gained independence by themselves, and it wasn't like super far away. It just happened like around 50 to 60 years ago. Um, Given that that's the case, it's important that these countries and for the governments of these countries to constantly feel like they need to keep on talking about their independence, keep on talking about the war effort, because they feel this is probably the most important fabric within the country as a whole. But the problem with this is there's a lot of abuse of power that basically happens as a result of this over glorified nationalism within these countries. So, say for example, if you look at the current situation between India and Pakistan, as long as the BJP and Pakistan military have influence in their respective circles, the peace seems unlikely. Mainly because I think the reason why both of these parties remain relevant is if they promote if they promote hate mongering against each other. So what do I basically mean by this? So for the Pakistani military, for them to stay relevant within Pakistan, and for people to constantly look up to them, Pakistani military always needs to show that India is a threat to Pakistan. Because if the general populace of Pakistan keep on believing that India is a threat and India might attack anytime, the love and the respect that they have to the Pakistani army will always remain. And this is extremely important because inside Pakistan there are a lot of economic issues. There are water shortage, power shortage, and the military constantly interferes with the elections in Pakistan. Yet they keep getting away with it, and the reason why they keep getting away with it is because people constantly feel that India is a constant enemy of Pakistan, and because a war might be coming anytime soon, the Pakistani military needs to be tolerated despite all the bad things that they're doing. That's one that's one way how they exploit nationalism in order to essentially stay relevant. The same with BJP as well. The reason why people the BJP and the anti-Muslim or the anti-minority or the pro-Hindu nationalism sentiment that they have, in a lot of cases, the reason why they are able to get away with it and constantly keep on getting votes as a result of this is because they're able to promote that there are enemies out there, enemies who are not Hindus, who are probably looking to attack us, and we need to defend you against them. Which is why they've passed a lot of bills that have stopped the inflow of Muslims into India, etc. And that also plans to kick out a lot of Muslims out of India as well. So I think that's where I think that strong sense of nationalism, which sometimes might be a good thing, is extremely exploitable and is exploited by the ruling elite in South Asia. And like I said, there is no incentive for the BJP and Pakistani military to have peace, because if they go for peace, then the reason for which they are so powerful will then become irrelevant in the longer run. So how is this then this nationalism then like spread throughout these countries? It mostly takes up the form of movies and songs about war. So if you look at like so I have had most amount of exposure to Bollywood and Bollywood media, and you'll constantly see songs about war, songs about war heroes, movies about war heroes, constantly propagating. And I'm sure all sides do this for them. And I think this is something like I said, these nations don't want to let go of, and they constantly want to keep on exploiting. So how do then locally these things, like how do they end up exploiting people? So firstly, you'll see politicians as their cults. Whenever they face some level of opposition, they'll start labeling that opposition as anti-independence or whatever they seem fit to a large extent. I think this is particularly relevant in the context of Bangladesh, where the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, every single policy that the current ruling party, the Bangladesh Awami League, wants to pass, they brand it under the name of the father of the nation, or they brand it under the name of Bangabandhu. And especially when the prime minister is his daughter himself, Sheikh Hasina. Everything. So if you say anything against Sheikh Hasina, uh, you are labeled as someone who is speaking up against Bangabandhu, and then you're labeled as someone who is speaking up against the independence itself. Which is why, to a large extent, a lot of people who would otherwise speak out against the government or speak out against the ruling elite, the normal people don't do that. And in a lot of cases, these things are often taken overboard. So, for example, in Bangladesh, you are legally punishable if you say anything against the war, or if you say anything against the actors who are involved in the war at that particular point of time. There have been numerous instances where teenage boys or teenage activists have been picked up from their homes by the secret police, because they posted a status that criticized the war, or that criticized how the war was handled in many situations. Which is why you'll see a lot of individuals not essentially like give political statuses about the situation in Bangladesh on Facebook, because of how afraid they are that they might be picked up. Is the exact reason why my video is not on at this particular point of time, mainly because of the fear that we have towards saying these things because we know that it's extremely dangerous in this particular situation. So this is why, to a large extent, how the next nationalism has been exploited to a huge extent by the existing politicians and the existing ruling elite at this particular point of time. However, I think the one thing that we essentially have to look for is that uh, even if like the exploitative nationalism has had its bad side, to a certain extent, uh, a lot of people brand it as a necessary evil, mainly because the alternative would have been far, far worse. So, say for example, in a country like Bangladesh, uh, we because we had war nationalism, it is often said that this is the most inclusive form of nationalism, because a lot of the people who are non-majority or who are minorities also fought in the war as well. That's why you have quotas for, like, minorities within armies, and a lot of minority soldiers have also gained a lot of respect to a large extent. A lot of people argue that even if war nationalism is bad, the alternative would probably have nationalism based on religion, or nationalism based on our religious identity as well. Which is why, to a large extent, because we have war nationalism, it's probably a much better alternative than religious nationalism to a large extent. However, I think this is extremely debatable because we don't know how how in retrospect this world would have turned out if we hadn't had war nationalism. But given the situation of communal violence that we've had in many areas in India and Bangladesh, probably this is not the worst possible alternative, because having based it on religious identity mean, would probably mean that the situation would be a lot more worse than what it is right now in terms of religious violence. Which is why I think there is a good debate to be had in terms of like these specific countries, which is to say, if these countries have nationalism based on war and wartime glory, is it a good thing? Because what is the alternative is just far, far worse in general. So yeah. All right. So what are the political makeup in certain regions in South Asia in particular? So I think, like I said, it heavily differs from country to country. So if you look at place like Bangladesh, since 2009, the ruling party in the country right now, which is called the Awami League, has basically been in power, and it's basically been a one-party rule, and it seems like it will be that way for a long, long time, as we essentially move forward. So, how do these governments, even though in theory they are democratic, how do they continuously stay in power for a long, long time without being thrown away from it? So, in terms of like they employ a few strategies. One is they constantly jail opposition leaders whenever there is a possibility. So in Bangladesh, whenever the Army League came into power, the first thing that they did was they opened up all the old cases against opposition leaders and they put them in jail. So the ones that remain in the country are in jail right now, and the ones that flew away are not, fled away, are not essentially politically viable at this particular point of time. Which is why the country at this particular point of time literally has zero opposition. And even if there and like yes, in theory there is still an opposition, but it's filled with individuals that we probably don't know because they aren't famous, because the ones who are famous or are influential are either in jail or hiding or are in exile in some other country at this particular point of time. Secondly, uh, to seem that they are fair and transparent, they don't directly own media institutions, but what they do is they indirectly influence a lot of media institutions. One of the best examples of how this happens is the example of the Daily Star, which is one of the most famous local newspapers in Bangladesh, and how they basically called out a few government ministers regarding corruption. What happened was governments in these countries know that newspapers are run on advertising, and the biggest advertisers in these countries are basically telecom companies. So what the government did was they told telecom companies that you cannot advertise in this specific newspaper. If you do, there'll be serious actions taken against you. So telecom companies then withdrew advertisement from this local newspaper, and the newspaper basically began to dry up. No funding whatsoever. They had to basically fire a lot of people, and eventually they realized that okay, if they don't receive funding, they basically will not be able to run the newspaper. Which is why from that day onwards, the Daily Star basically stopped writing, or stopped calling out the government in regards to specific issues. So and this is something that also Vladimir Putin does quite frequently as well in Russia as well. So I think that's how, to a large extent, in many of these states, the governments indirectly control media institutions, even if they're not. So because they're not legally allowed to own one, this is how they basically end up controlling them through indirect channels such as funding, etc., etc. So the other thing about this is, then you might ask that okay, what about the army's role over here? Because in Bangladesh, the army played a huge factor in making the country democratic, because there was a coup that overthrew an individual who was in power for a long, long time. The thing with the army in this particular scenario is that in Bangladesh specifically, the army basically relies on a give and take relationship with the government, which is to say that uh, as long as the army is happy, they don't basically go after the government, even though the army recognizes that the government is undemocratic. So for that to happen inside Bangladesh, Bangladesh government allows the army to basically own and operate private enterprises. So the army is allowed to own hotels, banks, as well as build highways, etc., through which they can make money. Army officials are also allowed to engage in private business um, when they reach a particular position within the army. Which is why, if you're a senior official within or in the army, or one of the higher commands within the military, you don't want the army league to go out of power, because if they do, that means you end up losing a lot of money. Which is why, even in this situation, even though this party is blatantly undemocratic, they basically aren't really held accountable, mainly because they know that the army knows that we don't want them to go away, because we'll end up losing a lot of money if that happens. Uh, in other cases, for example, in case of Pakistan, the nation's government is almost always under the influence of the Pakistani military. So if the Pakistani military doesn't really endorse a particular party, they that party will not win. So one of the biggest examples of this right now is the current ruling party of Pakistan, which is the PTI, uh, and most people believe that the reason why this party is in power is because of the military, mainly because the military has a huge amount of control over the election commission. The military is basically stationed at poll stations to ensure that voting is done in a proper manner. And the critics of this government and the opposition party have constantly claimed that this party in Pakistan is in power because the military essentially backed them, and that is something that has always been happening. The military in Pakistan has always been the driving force within the political influences within the country. And if the military doesn't essentially agree with you, then you're not essentially coming to power. So why is the military so important within Pakistan, and how did they establish so much dominance? So this basically resorts back to 1947, when the partition was made between India and Pakistan. At that point of time, the strongest component of Pakistan was the Pakistani military, and the Pakistani military itself was involved in reallocation of individuals from India to Pakistan. And because the British Empire had heavily invested in the army in the subcontinent to fight their wars, it meant that when the British left, the people with the most amount of resources, the people with the most amount of weapons, and the people with the most amount of influence were essentially army officials. Which is why the politicians then at that particular point of time were heavily reliant on the army for any operations whatsoever. And right after the partition, India and Pakistan were constantly at war against each other, which only grew the army's influence more and more as time went forward. So because of how the partition was done, and because the army at that point of time had the most amount of resources after the partition was done, that's why they're still in power, and they've maintained that level of power as we've moved forward uh, at this particular point of time. And this is why inside Pakistan, because the army is by far the strongest you know uh, entity. This is why it's very difficult for Pakistan to move out of the military influence at this point. And when it comes to India, once again, I think India, credit where credit is due, is still a very strong democracy. There's free and fair elections at all points of time, but obviously there's a lot of speculation right now in terms of how the BJP, which is the ruling party of this point of time, is trying to corrupt the entire process. I think once again a lot of this is speculation, but a lot of this is also true. I mean, and that's why I think it's important that, and because it's a lot to cover as well, so I think it's important that you do some level of research in terms of how the BJP is basically enticing riots, and how, to a large extent, they're trying to hijack the Supreme Court, and how, to a large extent, they're trying to harm the democracy inside India. Because I think it's a lot to digest, and I think this is something that you should probably like do some research upon in general. Even though it's a strong democracy, there are still some hacks to it, that they're trying to essentially do. Okay, speaking up against the powerful elites in this country. So there have been some movements in the past, uh, yeah, in certain situations where even though change seems quite difficult, there have been some hope that there might be some amount of change that does happen within these specific areas. So with Pakistan, there was a movement that started in 2019, I guess, which is known as the Pakistan Democratic Movement, and this is basically some of the strongest opposition parties in Pakistan coming together under one umbrella in order to oppose the current ruling elite of Pakistan. So basically, this is the first time where so the thing about Pakistan is most of the parties that existed, the army always used one against the other in order to ensure that there is no political unity in the country. Because if there is political unity in the country, that would basically motivate them to speak up against the military, which is why the military always exploited these political parties, and they, like I said, they put up one against another, so as to make sure that sorry, so as to make sure that there was never any unity. But under the Pakistan Democratic Movement, some of the biggest opposition parties in the country, which is the Pakistan Muslim League, as well as another political party, they basically came together under one umbrella, and they started calling out how this government is rigged, how this government is there only with the military. And this is the first time in a long time where so many political parties came together in Pakistan and were unified under one umbrella, and they started speaking up against the military as a whole. So I think there is some amount of research that you can do in terms of Pakistan Democratic Movement and how successful they were in terms of what they're trying to achieve, and whether or not in the future they'll be able to reduce the influence of the military within Pakistan. Secondly, when it comes to Bangladesh, uh, in Bangladesh, like I said, there's just really small scope of change, mainly because of how strong the government has been, because they've been in power for like more than 12 years. Also, because of how the military is unlikely to act. So there's it seems, and how because there's a lack of an opposition party because all of them are in jail or they're not as popular anymore. It just seems unlikely that there will be some scope of change that's likely to happen in this particular country. However, there were certain signs of you know change and certain signs of speaking up against the government in the form of student protests, mainly because of how there were some students who were killed by a bus driver because of horrible driving, and road and safety issues inside Bangladesh have been a huge issue over the last few years. And this is why we've seen multiple protests by students from in universities as well as schools and colleges against road safety, and how they want road conditions to be improved as well to a large extent. This is the only sign of defiance in the last few years against the government. The government did succumb to this pressure and promise some scope of change, but then after a few years, those changes are yet to come by. But this is the only time where the government generally felt some sort of pressure. So what it looks like to me is that if there is going to be some level of change in Bangladesh, it probably has to come through, come through the student-led bodies, because that seems like the only plausible change at this point of time. Otherwise, it just seems like a bleak situation, something that's unlikely to change in the future. But with students, maybe there is some level of hope. So I think you probably should do some research on student protests in Bangladesh and see how they went about, and how, to a large extent, government used violence against them as well to sort of quieten them down. The other thing, however, that also happens within political parties, in not just in Bangladesh and India and Pakistan, but also all across the board, is when if there is some level of infighting within the party itself. One of the examples of this is in BJP, is with like how a lot of people feel that Narendra Modi isn't the right person to lead BJP, and his second in command, Amit Shah, should be the one who basically goes up and do his job better. Or in especially also in situation in Bangladesh as well, a lot of people feel that the moment the prime minister, who's quite old at this particular point of time, if her health deteriorates, then the next person who is likely to be in power is not going to be strong enough to fulfill the same role that she has been able to do so. Which is why there is a lot of, which is why when it comes to strong parties who have been in power for a long, long time, one of the things that we don't notice about them is how there's a lot of internal infighting within those parties, and how there's a lot of animosity amongst party members as well, because all of them want to know that who is going to be the next in power. Because if you know that That's what it makes your life a lot easier, because you can plan ahead as well in those situations. So for these parties in specific, I think in this particular situation, uh, in BJP, in the Army League, there are signs of internal infighting that might in the future essentially lead to the deterioration of these parties as we move as we essentially move forward. So if you get a debate about these big structures or big institutions that have been power for a long time, one thing that you can always attack them for is that if there's a leader that is possibly about to move out quite soon, um, how do you essentially deal with that at that particular point of time, right? Lastly, when it comes to India, I think with India, the problem quite visibly is that despite Modi's failures in terms of economy, with the demonetizing policy and the farmers' protests and all the other social fuck ups that he's done, the fact is, to a large extent, he has still remained politically viable, and he still won the election by a landslide. The reason why that has been allowed to happen is unfortunately because uh, India's opposition party isn't basically strong enough. The Congress party right now, with Rahul Gandhi at the helm, is basically not attractive enough for voters to essentially vote for. Obviously, there are a lot of other reasons why BJP gets a vote as well, because of religion issues, as well as as well as issues of religion, as well as the lack of appeal from the Congress as well. So I think to a large extent, what is recommended by most experts as well is for Congress to sort of rethink the strategy, and probably also possibly also try to have a change in leadership as well, so as to make sure that the ills of the past aren't essentially repeated. Once again, over here, possibly try to do some level of research in regards to like India's elections, recent most elections, and how a lack of compromise on part of the Congress in terms of power sharing probably led them to lose the elections by a landslide margin. I think that will probably help you as well better understand where Congress went wrong when it comes to losing the election in particular. All right. Lastly, religious violence. Um, so I think the religious violence is a huge issue within South Asia, mainly because people being attacked for their faith, for practice of their faith in general. Religious tension has been very high in countries like Bangladesh, when recently Muslim mobs broke down Hindu temples in Diwali, or constantly when in India Muslims get beaten up because of the suspicion that they might be eating beef. So just to explain the nature of religious violence, I think there are two ways in which this is done. One is when religious violence is a lot more localized. So, for example, in countries like Bangladesh, the religious violence isn't endorsed by the state, but rather what happens in these situations is that yep. So in countries like Bangladesh, the nature of religious violence is more spontaneous and localized, which is to say, the government on paper appears to be secular or not inciting riots and stuff, but it's mostly done by religious groups within the country who feel like the country should be an Islamic state, and that's where the violence essentially starts from. In India, however, you'll often see government officials, ministers talk about committing violence themselves. So, for example, there's this person in India called Yogi Adityanath, who's a high-ranking government official, who talks about how for one Hindu killed, we should kill 100 Muslims, or who also talks about preparing for a religious war and all that stuff. So in India, you'll see a lot of state-sponsored religious violence, not directly but indirectly, and in Bangladesh, you'll see a lot of sporadic religious violence that's particularly not institutionalized, but happens because of religious influence from localized religious groups. However, in both situations, both the parties are both ruling elites are just unwilling to sort of like stop the religious violence, mainly because it's going to cost them some votes. So, for example, the BJP and the violence that Hindu mobs commit, they don't want to condemn the violence, because if they condemn the violence, they're likely to miss out on the huge voting bank of the Hindu Nationalist Party and the Hindu nationalists that are out there. Secondly, in Bangladesh, the government does not want to condemn the religious groups who essentially commit this violence, because once again, these this fundamentalist Muslim groups contain huge amount of funding and huge amount of political influence in the country, and they don't. And for the Army League, it's not as much as votes, because they probably have the votes covered, but they do care about these people committing huge amounts of violence again in all over the country, and that's why they let them get away with these things, because they don't want them to create a bigger problem than what they're creating, and they're more than happy to sort of like give away the minorities' rights in exchange of that. And that's why, in both these situations, both parties are unwilling to sort of like do anything about religious violence as a whole. Until this day, religious violence remains one of the most pertinent issues of South Asia. Our relationship with China in terms of South Asia. So most Asian nations, except maybe India, are in desperate need of financing, because all of them are within the developing stages of the country, and they want to get developed as soon as possible. Especially for countries like Pakistan, who have a huge shortage of power, which is why they accept funding from China, because under the One Belt One Road initiative, China promises to build infrastructure within these countries. That's why they build electricity grids for Pakistan within the China-Pakistan economic corridor, in exchange to get access to ports within get access to ports within Pakistan. So please do a bit of research about the China-Pakistan economic corridor and what it means for China, as well as Pakistan and other neighboring South Asian countries. And this has been one of the biggest issues within South Asia for a long, long time, especially when Pakistan applied for a loan under the new government with the IMF, and the IMF was extremely unwilling to pay the loan to Pakistan, mainly because the IMF was concerned that Pakistan would probably use the IMF loan to pay off Chinese debt, which is why they sort of like refused to pay the loan moving forward. So a bit of research on this would probably be helpful if motions do come about from that side. Thirdly, with India and China, if you've been following the news, they've had a lot of border skirmishes in the last year or so, because they're still not sure in terms of who controls what part of the border, because of the mountainous regions that are essentially over there. And that's why recently 2 Indian soldiers were also killed in a border skirmish with Chinese soldiers as well. But the reason why India cannot go out on a full out offensive against China, in terms of militarily as well as economically, is because uh, obviously there's a lot of economic dependency that India has on China and vice versa. But I think India's dependency is a bit more, mainly because most of like Indian exports that are done in outside nations are hugely dependent on raw materials that they get access to from China. So if China cuts those off, it hurts India to a large extent. Also, Chinese foreign reserves are much, much higher than Indian foreign reserves. That doesn't really matter to a large extent. But in this scenario, what it essentially goes on to show is that even though China knows that it's in a powerful position when it comes to India in terms of these border skirmishes. However, because of the economic dependency, China also knows that India can't go out on an all-out assault against them economically as well. So this is one of those tricky situations that the Modi government probably has to navigate when it comes to how they essentially want to do so. I think the reason why probably I picked this particular topic is because over the last year or so, there's been a lot of motions, actor motions, whereas this was as Narendra Modi will aggressively go up against China. And there's a lot of discussion in terms of like, does the BJP want to go up against China because they want to preserve their image of being a strong Hindu state who will not back down? But once again, there are economic repercussions as well to this, and those economic repercussions, if the BJP is dealt a strong blow, might loosen their strength and the power as they move forward as well. Lastly, in terms of like uh, Chinese relations in South Asia, you think you should also study about Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Chinese debt trap. How in these countries China has continuously looked to invest so as to ensure that they can that these countries fall in the debt trap, and they can get the resources or get access to their or ports and airports moving forward. Uh, Once again, this is a bit of an old issue, but it's still quite pertinent because China is still looking to do some level of expansionism within the South Asian region. So if you probably study about that a bit, might help you as well with the tournament. Um, yep. So, lastly, just to conclude, in terms of Indo-Pakistan peace, like I said in the first slide, just to recap, you need to understand that the reason why I think in the long run, at least in the near future, peace is unlikely, mainly because, like I said, the two forces that are in power, the BJP and um, the BJP and uh, the Pakistani military are unlikely to come to terms anytime soon, mainly because uh, the hate that they have towards each other is what essentially feeds their relevance. And if that particular hate goes away, they start becoming politically irrelevant moving forward, right? Which is why I feel in the longer run, even if there is no chances of violence, the chances of them coming together on the same table and sorting things out is also quite low as well. Mainly because, like I said, they don't want the enmity to go away. Because if it does go away, they're not relevant anymore. With that being said, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. If you did so, and best of luck for the tournament. And I hope this generally helps you with your preparation.